Good day. There have been many periods over the course of the 8-month war in Ukraine when it's not been easy to get a true sense of the situation on the ground. The fog of war has been particularly heavy. But I have to say that I've never known a time when the different narratives about events on the ground, specifically in Kherson region, have diverged so completely. First of all, there is a Western narrative, and it originates in Ukraine itself from Ukrainian general staff and Ukrainian media, it's the one that gets the most circulation in the Western media. It's also, by the way, backed by entities such as the Institute of the Study of War in Washington and the British Ministry of Defense. According to this view, the Russians have basically given up on Kherson region. Their civilian evacuation of Kherson region is a sign that they are no longer intending to try and defend their bridgehead west of the Dnieper River, and that they are now gradually pulling their troops out of Kherson region along certain pontoon bridges and barges that they have created to across the Dnieper. If one follows the logic of this, then that of course means that the Ukraine will be in control of Kherson, the whole of Kherson region, west of the Dnieper River, including Kherson city, within a couple of days or weeks at most. Now, there's some touches, there's some details that are occasionally given. For example, it's been claimed that 2,000 Russian troops are covering the retreat of the rest. That seems a very small number of troops to cover such a retreat, but anyway, that's what one sometimes hears. And this morning there were reports that 2 settlements in Kherson region, 2 more settlements have allegedly been captured by the Ukrainian army, which supposedly continues its advances on Kherson city. Well, that's the Western narrative. Russian narrative is quite different. There is a civilian evacuation continuing to take place from Kherson city and the surrounding region, but this has been the product of the need to protect civilians from missile and rocket attacks by the Ukrainian military and the potential threat of flooding in the event that there is a breach of the Novaya Kakhovka Dam caused by Ukrainian attacks to blow up the locks of this dam. As for the rest, Russian officials continue to insist that they are intending to hold on to Kherson city, and they report battles in which Ukrainian forces in comparatively small numbers seek to advance across the steppe towards the city, and then are attacked by Russian artillery and aircraft and are forced to retreat. Note, by the way, that these encounter battles, which do undoubtedly take place, are never reported by the Western media. There was that big defeat which the Ukrainians suffered on Wednesday, which I covered extensively in a recent video. There was another Ukrainian advance which was attempted yesterday with, it must be said, rather fewer troops this time, but it too was driven back and seems to have failed utterly. Now, I say that there's no doubt about the fact that these encounter battles do happen, because though all of the recent sources about these battles are Russian, they are backed by photographic evidence, by film evidence, and in this particular instance, by the capture of prisoners. So I don't personally have any doubts that these battles do actually take place. In the past, we've had indirect confirmation from Ukrainian sources themselves that such battles have happened and have not gone well for Ukraine. And of course, the various Russian sources that I'm talking about, which go beyond the Ministry of Defense, well, these include various military correspondents and bloggers who obviously are strongly on the Russian side. They are, after all, Russians, but who are often bitterly critical of the Russian Defense Ministry and the Russian military leadership and its various tactics and strategies. If you recall, especially at the time of the Kharkiv offensive, when Ukraine captured large areas of Kharkiv region, out of which the Russians were pulling out, the Western media actually started to report much of the commentary, which is bitterly hostile, of the Russian authorities, produced by these bloggers. Now, these bloggers, as I said, they may be biased people, they may have their strong biases, their strong feelings about this war, they may be very committed to the Russian side, they may hanker for a Russian victory. But I have consistently found them reliable. And I say that because sometimes one or other makes a mistake in reporting, at which the others join in, and there is often a certain discussion that takes place, and out of it, the truth sometimes, in fact, nearly always emerges. So these bloggers, when they describe these encounter battles, some of which previously have been confirmed by Ukraine, and especially given the confirmation from the prisoners and the pictures of knocked out machines, tanks and such things, and I have to say it, uncomfortable though it is to say it, dead bodies that one also sees. When these bloggers and reporters report on these things, I assume it to be true. One of the most reliable, Boris Rogin, has, for example, said today that those Ukrainian reports about capturing those two settlements that I discussed earlier, he says that they are not true, and that particular area of the Kherson front line is quiet. Now, if you listen or follow what these bloggers and reporters are saying, not just these bloggers and reporters, but also, I ought to say, Russian mainstream media are what they're saying, what they're reporting, is not that the Russian military is pulling out of Kherson city and of Kherson region, west of the Dnieper, but on the contrary, that it is reinforcing there, that more troops are being sent there. These are troops who are being sent across these same pontoon bridges. They're more than just pontoon bridges, by the way. They seem to be fairly elaborate constructions of a kind that the Russian and before that the Soviets had perfected. Anyway, that these forces are now being steadily sent across the Dnieper River to reinforce Russian positions on the west bank of the Dnieper, and that places like Kherson city itself are being gradually turned into fortress centers and will be heavily and fiercely defended. Well, which of these narratives is true? Now, I have to say straight away that obviously, since I'm based in London, I can only report what others are reporting. I'm not on the spot, and I should say that, as I've intimated in the past, the possibility of evacuating Russian troops across the Dnieper River, in other words, abandoning the bridgehead on the west bank and Kherson city itself, I am sure is one that the Russian High Command has entertained and apparently is still entertaining. I say that because in that interview, which the overall commander of Russian forces in this war, General Surovikin, gave a few days ago, he spoke of very difficult decisions and that he might make depending upon the tactical situation in Kherson region. And I noticed that he did not exclude the possibility of evacuating the military, the Russian military, from its bridgehead west of the Dnieper. So I think that if things turn really difficult for the Russians, they would probably do that. But I must also say that my overall sense is that that is not the plan at the moment. I think it is probably true that the Russians are indeed reinforcing west of the Dnieper rather than pulling back. And after all, those 2,000 men who the Ukrainians say are a covering force, from what I could gather, and it's not easy for me to make sense of these reports sometimes, the Ukrainians were saying that these 2,000 men have recently been deployed into Kherson region, crossing from the east bank to the west bank of the river, which would it seems, if I'm getting this correct, sort of confirm that Russian troop movements are indeed happening from the east to the west bank rather than the other way around. Anyway, as I said, I can only discuss what others are reporting. I am not an eyewitness. The other thing that makes me think, however, that the Russian reports are probably the more accurate is that television interview which I discussed yesterday, which was made by a former spokesman of the Ukrainian General Staff. Now, this person spoke about 30,000 Russian troops in the area, about Russia having sent reinforcements across the river, about the Russians digging in, and about the Russians having built all of these bridges, having solved their earlier logistical problems. Now that seems to correspond with the Russian narrative rather than with the Ukrainian Western one. So for the moment, I am going to assume that General Surovikin has not yet made the difficult decision to pull back from western Kherson region across the Dnieper River into eastern Kherson region, that he's not abandoning, he's not decided to abandon Kherson city, and that for the moment the Russians are indeed digging in. Indeed, it could be that at some point the Russians might even be considering something different, which is launching an offensive in this area of their own. Now, I want to stress we're now entering into areas that go beyond reporting, and this might be completely wrong. But there is one rather interesting piece of information which has come out over the last 24 hours, which suggests that the Ukrainians, even whilst they talk about a Russian pullback from Kherson city and from the west bank of the Dnieper River, that on the contrary, the Ukrainians may be now worried about a Russian offensive. And this is that the mayor of Nikolaev, this important city, Ukrainian-controlled city, between Kherson city and Odessa, that the mayor of Nikolaev has now also advised all citizens of Nikolaev, the entire civilian population of Nikolaev to leave the city entirely, and not even to think about returning until the war is over. So at the same time as the Russians are carrying out what appears to be a very organized, or at least an organized, evacuation of the civilian population of Kherson city, the mayor of Nikolaev is calling for an evacuation of Nikolaev. I would point out that just as the Western media doesn't ever report those encounter battles on the Ukrainian steppe, the Kherson steppe, where Ukraine persistently loses, so the Western media has not reported these comments made by the mayor of Nikolaev about an evacuation from that city. Now that again perhaps suggests that things are not going entirely well for Ukraine in this area, that expectations of an advance on Kherson city are perhaps not as widely shared as the Western media would have us believe, and that in fact, far from feeling confident that they have the situation in hand, the Ukrainians are worried that before long it will be the Russians who are back on the attack in this area. Anyway, that's all I can say about the situation. I would just add one last point, which is that yesterday, for some reason, the internet was cut off in Kherson city. It was impossible to access Kherson city in that kind of way. There's been lots of discussion and speculation about why that happened. Clearly, the Russians turned off the internet in Kherson city. But why did they do that? Some thought that it was to cover their retreat. Possible. It could equally plausibly be to cover their advance. One way or the other, the fact is that as of today, the Russians are still in Kherson city. They don't appear to be abandoning it. And the information from the front lines is that the situation remains across the front lines in Kherson region fairly static as of this time, despite those earlier since contradicted claims from Ukraine that they captured those two settlements. Now, I am going to go a little bit further from this point, and I'm going to make a number of comments about Ukrainian tactics here, because I have not been able to understand the nature of Ukrainian tactics over the course of this Kherson offensive. I had been expecting, when Ukraine first talked about this offensive, that the Ukrainians would deploy tens of thousands of troops. We've heard lots of reports of Ukraine deploying tens of thousands of troops to advance on Kherson region, that they would attack in force across the front lines, and that we'd be seeing major battles and that kind of thing. Well, I accept I'm not a military person, so perhaps that was simply a view about how the Ukrainians would conduct this offensive, which was based on ignorance. I'm the first person to admit that. I don't always understand these military situations terribly well. But what has happened instead is that instead of this, grand offensive that I expected, and by the way, been led to expect from some of the reporting, it seems to me that after the first few days, the Kherson offensive, Ukraine's Kherson offensive, has amounted to attacks by relatively small forces, 2 or 3 brigades, battalions at a time, backed sometimes by tanks, though it seems increasingly less so, attacking particular points in the front line, making a few advances, coming under artillery and aircraft attack, suffering losses, and then pulling back. The one attack that was a partial exception was that attack which Ukraine carried out at the start of this month, at the beginning of October, when an armoured column, perhaps 150 armoured vehicles, and perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 men, was able to advance up an asphalt road on the west bank of the Dnieper River until it was stopped by the Russians at the village of Duran. Well, 3,000 men is a large force compared to the other forces that Ukraine has thrown into the battle at various times across Kherson region. But even that doesn't come close to the 50, 60,000 people that you hear about. It looks like a relatively small force, even if it's assumed to be a sort of spearhead. And by the way, since we're talking about spearheads, there's almost never any follow-up to these attacks by these relatively small forces. And I want to repeat again that the attack which got to Duchani and which the Ukrainians launched at the beginning of October, though involving, to my mind, relatively few troops, was still significantly bigger than any other attack Ukraine has been launching in this region over the last few weeks. The force, for example, which was defeated on Wednesday, is said to have numbered around 1,000 men, and the force that was defeated yesterday was perhaps smaller still, perhaps 800 or so men. So the Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region seems to me to have been more a case of Ukraine attacking in penny packets, small numbers, small groups of soldiers attacking parts of the Russian front line, and in nearly all cases, the case at the start of October being the exception, but in nearly all cases being repelled, usually after suffering heavy losses. And I have to say, this just doesn't make any kind of sense to me. It's been suggested by many people that these are not real offensives, these are not real attacks, they are reconnaissance in force. But I have to say that and I've said this before, that the forces used, 1,000 men here, 800 men there, seem to me too large to be simple reconnaissance exercises. And as I've said already, surely Ukraine has means to conduct surveillance and to monitor what is going on the battlefield. Well, perhaps over the course of next week, we will see something bigger. We will see these large forces that are supposed to be present in Nikolaev and Kryvyi Rog, the two big Ukrainian cities that are closest to these battlefields in Kherson region, whether we will finally see these all cranking into action and start moving south towards Kherson city. But I wonder whether there isn't actually an alternative explanation, and that is that Ukraine and perhaps its Western advisors don't really plan an offensive on that kind of scale and never really have done. What they've been trying to do is cause so much difficulty for Russian resupply efforts to their forces west of the Dnieper through the shelling of the bridges, the Antonovsky Bridge, the Novaya Kakhovka Dam Bridge, these threats against the Novaya Kakhovka Dam, that eventually the Russians decide that it's simply not worth the effort holding on west of the Dnieper, that there is in fact a real risk that their forces west of the Dnieper will be completely cut off from resupply, and indeed even be trapped west of the Dnieper, which would be a major disaster for the Russian military, and that the Russians will therefore, in effect, do what they did in Kharkiv region, which is pull back without fighting. In which case these attacks in penny packets might make a certain kind of sense. They are being carried out, or they would be carried out, not so much in order to break through the Russian defenses as to find out whether those Russian defenses are still operating at all. In other words, if the Russians are pulling back, then they might not be in a position to defend against these columns, these of troops that Ukraine every so often sends into battle in this area, at which point Ukraine could do what it did in Kharkiv region, which is claim great victories on the strength, on the back, if you like, of a Russian pullback. Well, that's my guess. I'm not saying this is so. Events might prove this speculation wrong, but it perhaps might explain why for several weeks now Ukrainian and British and American commentators have been harping on so relentlessly about the Russians considering a total withdrawal of their forces west of the Dnieper River, that what they're talking about the Russians doing is not what is actually happening. It is what they want to happen, and that's why they talk about it all the time. Well, we will see. As I said, it's important to stress that Surovikin, the overall Russian commander, has not ruled out the possibility of such a pullback. Perhaps it will happen. Perhaps that's what he decides to do, despite the fact that doing so will be, to put it mildly, badly received in Russia itself. But, we'll just have to see. Of course, the alternative that the Russians are reinforcing and that they have the situation in Kherson region effectively under control might also be true, in which case we will see what that means. Let me repeat again, I'm not in the area, I'm not an eyewitness, I can't speak to the people who are directly there. I don't know enough about what is going on to give an authoritative answer to this enigma. Anyway, one other thing I will say before I round up talking about this area of the war, which is that in my previous discussions, I expressed significant doubt about this story that one is reading in many places, that it is the Russians who are planning to blow up the Novaya Kakhovka Dam, and that they're saying that it's the Ukrainians who are trying to do this, is in effect an attempt to blame the Ukrainians for something that the Russians are going to do, in other words, to create a false flag type of situation. Now, I've expressed deep skepticism about this, and one of my most erudite military commentators wrote to me a very long email yesterday on this precise topic, in which this person, who has a military background, pointed out that the Novaya Kakhovka Dam is important for the proper maintenance of the Kakhovka reservoir, and that water from that reservoir is used to keep the reactors, to provide coolant to the reactors of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. The continued operation, safe operation of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant might be, probably would be compromised if the dam were destroyed or breached and if the water levels in the reservoir were to fall. Now, presumably, that is not what the Russians would want, which makes it even less likely, so it seems to me, that the Russians are seriously contemplating blowing up the Novaya Kakhovka dam, and that makes it much more plausible that if anybody's trying to do it, it is the Ukrainians. I would say that this pattern of blaming the Russians for things that it is Ukraine which is unquestionably doing, that this is not new in this war. The shelling of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and these repeated amphibious attacks which Ukraine has been carrying out to try to capture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant have gone almost completely unreported in the West. And on numerous occasions, I've read articles which come very close to implying that it's the Russians who are shelling themselves at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which is, of course, absurd and which has been, in fact, been quietly acknowledged by US sources to be absurd and, in fact, factually wrong. So it seems to me that with that kind of track record of there's no reason to suppose, there's no reason to doubt rather, that it is Ukraine that is currently threatening the integrity of the Novaya Kakhovka dam, if anybody is. Anyway, that's where I'm going to wrap up on the military developments on the ground. The missile strikes yesterday were on an enormous scale. The Ukrainians claim that the Russians launched 38 cruise missiles and 16, I believe, uranium-2 kamikaze drones. By the way, I read a very erudite article in the Russian media which says quite categorically that the uranium-2 drones are not loitering munitions. They don't loiter. They are, if you like, cheap, propeller-driven cruise missiles, but they don't loiter waiting to identify a target and then falling on that target like the Lancet drone, the Russian Lancet drone does. And on the contrary, they follow their pre-programmed flight path to their target, and that has nothing to do with loitering. Just to say, that's what I've read. Seems to me fully convincing. I'm not going to refer to it as a loitering munition again. But anyway, that's what the Ukrainians say, that there was 36 cruise missiles and 16 uranium-2 drones. And they also claim, by the way, to have shot down 18 of those cruise missiles. In other words, exactly half. The Russians have cast doubt on Ukrainian claims to have shot down that many missiles. But anyway, whatever. By the way, I should say in parentheses, I am again essentially with the Russians on this one. But anyway, regardless, a lot of missiles were launched at Ukraine. There's been more missile strikes, by the way, today, though, again, it's difficult for me at the moment to get a sense of the whole tempo, but an awful lot of damage was done. And slowly, gradually, the power system, the Ukrainian electricity system is becoming degraded. And I understand that the very latest missile strikes are now starting to have an impact on the functioning of Ukraine's railway system, which depends heavily on electric traction, and which, of course, Ukraine relies upon in order to transfer its weapons from the West and to send its reinforcements and to redeploy its forces from one front to another. Again, let me repeat, the most intelligent, the most informed non-Russian source about this missile offensive remains for me John Helmer at Dancing with Bears, though if you go to Russian Telegram channels, some of them publish in English, you will find Rebar, for example, gives very detailed accounts of what has been struck on any particular day. Anyway, that's where we are. I remain of the view that this offensive will continue, and then when this missile offensive will continue, and then it will crank up into a higher gear when the Russians do whatever it is that they plan to do. By the way, on that topic, lots of speculations about what that Russian force in Belarus is going to do. The suggestions that rather than attack Kiev itself, it might be intended to advance on Volyn with a view, that's a western region of Ukraine, with a view to perhaps cutting off the supply lines, the western supply lines to Ukraine itself. Well, I'm not going to get into that at the moment. I think that for the moment, the number of Russian troops deployed to Belarus is simply not enough for the kind of offensives people are talking about. If many more Russian troops are deployed to Belarus, well, then we can start thinking hard about the possibilities of such offensives. But for the moment, it seems to me that it's premature to discuss those kind of options that the Russians might have. Anyway, a number of other things have been going on at the same time. Firstly, and very interestingly, and still very strangely, we've had that odd visit by the British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace to Washington, D.C., where he met with Lloyd Austin, giving as his reason the fact that communications between Washington and London had been compromised in some way. An extraordinary assertion, and one that I really find very difficult to understand. As I've said before, even if it was indeed the case that communications between London and Washington had been compromised, would a British Defence Secretary at this time be admitting the fact? I mean, I don't understand it at all. But anyway, interestingly, directly after Lloyd Austin met with Wallace in London, in Washington, as I've discussed in previous videos, he then telephoned or at least had a conversation with Sergei Shoigu, Russia's defense minister. And as it turns out, that was only the first of a series of conversations that Shoigu has been having. Shoigu has also spoken to the French and Turkish defense ministers by telephone, which leaves open the possibility that it was Shoigu, that it was the Russians who in some way instigated all these telephone exchanges. And the Russians are apparently now telling everybody that they are seriously worried that Ukraine is now considering using some kind of dirty bomb, in other words, some kind of non-explosive radioactive device cobbled together out of nuclear materials in this war. Now, about a week ago, when General Surovikin gave his interview to Russian television, he spoke about Ukraine using prohibited weapons, using prohibited methods in the war. And shortly after, we started to hear all these reports about a civilian evacuation from Kherson region. And now we learn that the Russian defense minister is calling up defense ministers of France and the United States and Turkey, and is having some kind of correspondence with the British, and that at least in some of these conversations he was broaching the issue of Ukraine using a dirty bomb. Now, what is going on? I mean, first of all, is Ukraine contemplating using such a system? Well, to be straightforward about it, I don't believe it. I find that Ukraine might want to do something like that, so reckless and so dangerous that I just can't bring myself to imagine that Ukraine would do such a thing. But Shoigu may have information which I don't have access to. And perhaps the Russians do believe it. And perhaps these evacuations from Kherson region are connected to this. Perhaps they're worried that the Ukrainians are indeed planning some kind of use of such a weapon, possibly in Kherson region, and that this explains why the Russians are taking the action that they are, evacuating civilians, urgently contacting Western defense officials, giving the kind of warnings that they are. I'm going to say this: if the Ukrainians are contemplating doing this, I think that the militaries of the United States and Britain and France will take it very seriously. And I think that they will give warnings to the Ukrainians not to do it, and that they will also warn their own civilian leaderships of the enormous dangers in doing such things. Well, I hope so anyway. I mean, this is a developing story. We might not get much more about it over time. I should say that Ukraine does undoubtedly have the capability to produce such a weapon. But as I said, I still balk at the idea that they are seriously considering doing it. And the fact that the Russians seem to be contacting and complaining about it to the Western powers suggests that the Russians, whatever access, whatever intelligence they have about this, don't believe that the Western powers are themselves involved. Anyway, we will see. What I will say is this: one other development that has come out, maybe not directly from these calls, is that it seems that Turkey has relaxed its restrictions on movements of Russian submarines through the Dardanelles, in other words, into and out of the Black Sea. And one possible reason for that is concern about the security of the Turk Stream pipeline, with Turkey now fully signed up to Vladimir Putin's gas hub proposal, which will involve a very substantial expansion of Turk Stream, and that the Turks therefore want the Russians to maintain a stronger submarine presence, underwater presence in the Black Sea, in order to protect that pipeline, and that might be why they're easing on their previous restrictions, their prohibition, their earlier prohibition on Russian submarines entering and exiting the Black Sea via the Dardanelles. Putting that aside, if more Russian submarines are deployed to the Black Sea, if the Turks do indeed allow that, then it will mean two things. Firstly, the relationship between Turkey and Ukraine, which has until fairly recently been very close, is now under severe strain, and there are growing reasons to actually believe that is indeed the case. It seems that Ukraine is becoming alarmed and angry that Turkey is starting to tilt increasingly towards Russia. So it would mean that, which would be an important geopolitical event. But secondly, a reinforcement of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea, including with submarines, means, of course, that the Russians are in even stronger control of the Black Sea. And, of course, more submarines presumably means more launchers for Kalibr missiles from the Black Sea against Ukrainian ground defenses. Anyway, we will see whether that happens also. So, lots going on, not always clear what exactly is going on. Talks of Russian evacuations from the right bank of the Dnieper, the west bank of the Dnieper, contradicted by Russian sources, which, on the contrary, suggest the opposite. Talk about dirty bombs. I've made my own views about that clear, but it does seem to be causing some alarm, possibly more Russian submarines in the Black Sea. One way or the other, however, things do seem to be moving steadily towards a major escalation, probably at the end of November, start of December, when the winter frosts begin. Anyway, that's the military situation at the moment, as I said, not just on the battlefronts, but in the war as a whole. Lots going on economically. Ukraine has now essentially admitted that it cannot sustain its civilian economy any longer, that its civilian economy has fallen flat, and that Ukraine can only keep going if the West provides, in effect, unlimited financial support. The European Union are now talking about giving Ukraine $1.5 billion a month to cover its budget. The United States is providing Ukraine with the same amount of money each month. That's on top of aid that is already being provided to Ukraine by the West. It's clear that Ukraine's civilian economy, to all intents and purposes, no longer functions. It seems to me that at a time of severe economic crisis, with recessions looming across Europe, with living standards plunging, the Western powers now have the massive added burden of keeping Ukraine going on their hands. And Mr. Vučić, the president of Serbia, has said that if the war goes on for another year, which, by the way, is quite likely, or even if it doesn't, even if the Russians say win, but if the economic war goes on for another year, that Europe won't be able to withstand it. Well, we'll see. And of course, on top of that, we have the psychodrama in London following the implosion of Liz Truss's government, her forced resignation, the big question about whether Rishi Sunak will become the new British Prime Minister and what he will do if he does, and whether Boris Johnson will act as his challenger and might become Prime Minister instead. On that particular point, most of my discussions, all of my discussions, in fact, on British politics, on the minutiae of what is going on there, will take place on our main channel, the Duran. Regardless, very interesting to contrast the chaos in London, the psychodrama in London with this very orderly process in Beijing, where Xi Jinping has just been re-elected for a third term as party general secretary. And by the way, my comments of yesterday about the Hu Jintao incident have elicited a wide spectrum of reaction from various people. I'm going to say this: I stand by my position that it was almost certainly health related. The entire incident was almost certainly health related, and I've received various comments from various Chinese people who are familiar with this sort of thing, and they too endorse my view that it was almost certainly health related. And this, by the way, is something which the as I understand it, the Xinhua news agency is also saying. To repeat, I think it is inconceivable that Hu Jintao would be sitting next to Xi Jinping on a dais in the Great Hall of the People, with China observing, the whole of China observing what is going on through television, if there had been serious problems between within the leadership. And beyond that, anybody who looks at that film objectively, I can't help but think they would agree that Hu Jintao didn't look well when the whole incident took place. Anyway, the key point is that Xi Jinping is now once more General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, or I should say the Communist Party of China. I'm going to refer to it in future by the preferred initials it itself uses in English, which is CPC, Communist Party of China, not CCP, which its Western critics prefer to use. But anyway, Xi Jinping is now once again General Secretary of the CPC. There's been an enormous amount of commentary about all of this in the West, lots of commentary about the people who've been appointed alongside him to the Politburo and to the Politburo Standing Committee and to the Secretariat and to the other agencies of the central agencies of the CPC. And if you read Western media, you would get the impression that there's been some kind of massive purge, that Xi Jinping has put his own people in place and removed all his potential rivals and has consolidated control, and that he's now charting a course for China which takes China back into a state of isolation and belligerency towards the West. I'm afraid I don't buy any of it. I ploughed through Xi Jinping's report to the party congress. It's long. I have to say, I didn't see that it deviated in any fundamental way from well-established party principles and policies as these have evolved over the decades. It is certain. I'm not in a position to comment about Chinese personnel changes. I'm not going to start talking about engaging in the sort of Kremlinological speculations about who's up and who's down in the leadership and what this means. I don't know anything about these people who've been promoted and those who haven't been, and I'm not going to try and guess what their appointments and promotions or lack of them mean. But overall, it seems to me that the emphasis was very much on continuity, steady as it goes. The sense is that things have been going reasonably well in China, and there's no reason for fundamental change, and certainly no backtracking or change on the kind of economic system that China has developed very painstakingly over the last 30, 40 plus years since the Deng Xiaoping era. What I would say is this: there was a certain emphasis, a greater emphasis than there has been in the past about on the military, on building up the military, on China having a strong military. And Xi Jinping did speak very firmly about unification, with Taiwan being inevitable, and about China being prepared to take military action to ensure that it happens. Now, here we come back to this constant problem one always has when discussing not just China but also Russia as well, which is that the Western powers, specifically in this case the United States, take over time an increasingly hostile approach to a particular country. In the case of China, it began midway through the Trump era. Firstly, there was the economic tariffs. I think the Chinese took those in their stride. But then it broadened into attacks on Chinese influence. There was the Huawei affair, which I've discussed in videos on this channel. There was the arrest of Huawei's chief financial officer. There were all kinds of things of that kind. And then it's escalated even further over the period of the Biden administration, with Biden talking to the Chinese with what I can only describe as a forked tongue in one-to-one sessions with Xi Jinping. He assures them that US policy on Taiwan is unchanged, that the United States continues to adhere to its one China policy. And then as soon as he leaves those meetings, all sorts of things are done by the administration which show that those words from Joe Biden aren't meant seriously, and that the United States is in fact quietly supporting the anti-Beijing forces, if you like, in Taiwan. And now, of course, we've had recently the US decision to block, or to try to block, exports of advanced microchips to China. So we've had a steady cranking up on the part of the Western powers of actions which the Chinese would see as hostile. Now, you may think, many people I know in the United States thinks that these actions are justified, that China has been becoming increasingly assertive over recent years, that it took advantage of the United States previously, that it's become a dangerous rival to the United States, and it is proper for the United States to push back against China in light of that. But all I will say is that if the United States does act in that way, why be surprised if the Chinese themselves start to push back in return? After all, over and above all the things that the US has done, there's also a massive media campaign against China. There's criticisms, relentless criticisms of China on human rights grounds, on what China is doing or supposed to be doing in its western regions. I'm choosing my words very carefully, as everybody can tell. Well, why expect that the Chinese would not be concerned about that and might not start to take action in response? For example, building up their armed forces, setting up their own supply chains independently of those of the Western powers, taking precautions, in other words, to secure themselves from the risk of US-led blockades, forging closer links with Russia to secure access to vital food and raw materials. Also, perhaps, as well as that, making clear that any step towards independence by Taiwan would invite a Chinese military response. I mean, if you push against a party, don't be surprised if that party pushes back. And I think this is a simple, common sense view of what is happening. And of course, the logic of that also is that if the Chinese do feel that they're now coming under intensifying pressure from the United States, and Xi Jinping's report strongly suggests that, then it's perhaps unsurprising if political leaders in China who once were seen as wanting good relations with the United States are now being made to step aside as new leaders who are perhaps more skeptical of relations with the United States are promoted in their place. Far too often, Westerners seem blind to the consequences of their own actions. Somebody who's followed the evolution of Russian-Western relations, I have to say this whole thing between the West and China has an extraordinary sense of déjà vu. Just as Putin and his officials, when they first appeared on the scene in the early 2000s, had no thought, in my opinion, of entering into some sort of rivalry or hostility to the West, but have step by step found themselves pushed into that position as a result of steps and actions that the Western powers have taken. So it seems to me that the Chinese, with or without eagerness on Xi Jinping's part, I know very little about the man. I know very little about his views on these issues. I doubt that anybody does. But one way or the other, it seems to me completely unsurprising that as they come under this kind of pressure, the Chinese take these sort of precautions. And I doubt whether it was originally their intention to distance themselves from the West, but that's where we've come. Anyway, that's me for the day. I've gone just over an hour, and I think that's a good moment to stop, and stop now I will. There'll be a lot more happening, no doubt, over the next few days. We'll get, no doubt, some clarity about the Kherson situation before very long, and obviously I will continue to cover it. Anyway, just to remind you, you can find us on other platforms, Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Telegram, and of course we're now also on Rofkin. And you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. And you can also go to our shop and buy yourselves the great things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.